Jawara, welcome to SHOWstudios in fashion.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I've read that you began becoming interested in fashion at 13. What interested you first about fashion and clothes?
I always used to sketch characters since I could hold a pencil, really. My interest, I guess, was in the artistry of sketching, but I was never really good at faces. So I would always use the garments as that point of differentiation. And then after doing that for so long, you start to realize that actually you're way more interested in what the body has on than the body itself. But it was only when I was 13 that I realized that actually, I think there's a real interest in fashion side of it rather than the sketching side of it. It wasn't something that I really thought about as truly realistic until I moved to Cayman. And also at that time, you're 13, so you're becoming older and you're becoming more aware of the world around you. While I was growing up in Jamaica, between birth and 12, 13, I would always visit Cayman in the summers and spend basically spend the whole summer there because my mother worked in Cayman while I lived in Jamaica. So I would always visit before moving there at 12.
Fashion really isn't a very linear space, and I think a lot of people find it quite a confusing thing to navigate because you have these creative interests, but knowing where you want to put them can be hard to kind of realize.
Totally. Because also I think one of the reasons for that is that the other jobs in fashion are not as talked about as design or as heavily publicized as design. I guess my real interest got fed when I moved to Cayman and I got my first job at a bookstore at 13. And I worked in that bookstore until I left Cayman at 19. I think that's really where I learned a lot about the world. I'm really a book nerd from having basically grown up in a bookstore in Cayman. It started out, I guess, with comics. I was always really interested in comics, even before I went to Cayman. The sketching behind it, the creation, there was something, and also like comics is printed on a really specific paper that is really, I think for a child, really attractive for some reason. I think it has like a nice texture and smell to it. The bookstore, I think at that time was maybe the only one. So it would get all the books. So you had comics, you had books for kids, had books for adults, you had novels, Harry Potter, like everything would come through there, including the fashion magazines. So I think my real knowledge in the industry started to become filled once I started working there and had access to these magazines. And at that same time was the era of McQueen, Galliano, Albert Elbaz, Carl at Chanel. Those were sort of the designers that I was really looking towards, like really seeing what they were doing in the industry and understanding the practice of design and fashion and how you can build a show and how you can expand a narrative. The contrast between Carl at Chanel and McQueen, both were presenting versions of tailoring that were in opposite sides of one another. So you had Carl that was presenting tailoring that was really clean, chic, minimal, historic. It stayed true to the shapes of Chanel, narrative around who the Chanel woman is that we still see today. It was really defined, whereas all of what McQueen was doing was in defiance of that. It was cutting tailoring for the 2000s, for the new woman, for the woman of the future, for the woman of the last 10 years, for women that have had experiences that don't often get talked about in fashion as well. And I think really seeing all of those different players gave me a good understanding of what skills can be applied in fashion to tell a story, to build something that is good.
I obviously just know you as being very kind of bubbly and outgoing and not introverted at all in a sense. I mean, I think if you grow up introverted, you still maintain a sense of that. But when did that shift happen where you kind of came out of yourself more?
I think it happened it started happening when I moved to London. I think I learned how to do and develop fashion by doing a show every year. So since I was 16, I did my first show at 16, and I did a show every year. I started with this program called Fresh, and it was kind of like a community version of Fashion East. It was like a incubator program for designers and people who were working in costume to essentially was a competition. The institution is called the Cayman National Cultural Foundation, and essentially they are in charge, or one of their ethos is exploring Cayman culture and giving space for the practice and development of the industry around creative mediums. They were funded by the government to do different kinds of programs, and I was a part of a fashion program. But I think starting that just made me realize that actually I can do it. And then I just kept doing it. I was kind of building a system around my skill and my talent. Being able to bring something new, you need to have a different perspective and a different point of view. And I think because of all of that time, I was practicing fashion in different ways. I think that's really what gives me and allows me to step a little bit outside of the system, but still creating something that speaks to the system. What comes out of me naturally is anti-fashion. My history and my theory and my practice is all within fashion. So this is a really interesting, I think, grounding that I had that allows me now to be able to see multiple different sides of how you can create.
I'm interested in how you think about clothing now. You know, we're talking about this idea of kind of character studies, having these different perspectives of moving between places. And I've read you kind of speaking about the idea of your collections as case studies and thinking about cultural development and improvement. So I guess I want to start by asking how you think about clothing. Like, do you see it as a form of language, that idea of case studies, like how you treat clothing now?
My research in general is always coming from a psychological, sociological, sociopolitical, anthropological point of view. I think that's really where my philosophical interests lie. So when I think about fashion, I can see it from multiple different ways and holding multiple different meanings. There's obviously the practice of fashion on the global stage. I think fashion that doesn't permeate culture has lost its meaning. But that's not really what they're doing. Everything is just commercial, but has different names. When fashion meets the streets, I think that's really where it starts to be interesting. How do people pull from the runway to include into their own wardrobes? Can people pull from the runway to include into their own wardrobes? If everything that's being shown on the red carpet or on the runway is inaccessible, then you're creating two different worlds where you're presenting things that people will never be able to access or wear. You kind of need to break it down so that you're tackling different things each time. And really you're trying to connect the whole as a puzzle, as opposed to one collection holding so much meaning that kind of encapsulates everything. I'm really interested in setting up pillars of all the areas of interest that exist within who I am and what I was doing. Because my journey in fashion didn't start when I was 19. It started way before that. You have to really be able to break things down in a way that allows for different kinds of conversation to happen each time you meet that collection on the runway.
Where did the signature safety pin come from? Is that a Caymanian feature in drapery, or is it something you came up with? What does it mean?
I think when I was a teenager, I was inspired by a lot of anti-fashion movements. Growing up in Jamaica, my father was Rastafarian, so I grew up within I grew up in a Christian household, but with a Rastafarian background, and my community, a lot of people within my community knew my father, then they would always remind me of who I was in relation to my father, and my father being a Rastafarian who, within the community, I think meant a lot of things to a lot of people. I never knew my father. I mean, I knew him when I was 1 and 2, and then he moved away, and then I never saw him, and then he passed away. I always grew up with people telling me, giving me the values that he had, just within the community. It made me always question philosophically where things creatively land. Reggae is a holder of philosophy, it's a holder of politics, it's where, and I think Black music in general, it's where we place a lot of our stories, a lot of our anger, a lot of our concerns, a lot of our anguish. So growing up hearing reggae lyrics, it gave me a sort of base for how you question things, what kind of things are important, what kind of philosophies are you aligned with. Interestingly enough, when I started to learn about rock music had a lot of those same philosophies in questioning the system and calling out the police force, and like it's two completely different expressions that are stemming from the same roots. So when I moved to London, I was looking for the same kind of feelings that I had growing up in the spaces in Jamaica, or growing up in the spaces in Cayman. And I guess that's where I gravitating towards people who had something more to say, rather than just creating something that fulfills an aesthetic desire. You can create something that's aesthetic, but also, what is it questioning behind that? Is it subverting anything? Is it saying anything more than red or green or blue? I think my first reckoning with it was from seeing it within the punk movement and sort of like having that image in my head that the safety pin represents anti. I always used to use it when I was a kid before I knew how to properly sew, and I would always pin things together.
I like that though, because you've got the safety pins kind of, like I remember the dress that you made for Albert Claire for the Fashion Awards, and maybe as a child you use it in place of being able to dressmake. But now it's not in place of that. It's very much a structural tool for how you drape and shape on the body.
The use of the safety pin is something that unlocks an avenue for me to create things that I haven't seen before. And I'm always interested in chasing those avenues where there's something genuinely interesting that could come out on the other end. Something that also has been made by the hand. I think that's also something that my work is constantly questioning, because when I graduated in COVID, I didn't really have access to buying fabrics or sewing machines. And that's really where the usage of the safety pin really took off. Because when I was on the MA, I remember saying to Fabio, I'm thinking of using the safety pin. And he was like, well, then do it. And then I never did, because I never really thought that it was that important. On the MA, I never wanted to be a budget designer. So I was like, I'm interested in that, but actually, that's not really what I want to be known for. So I'm not going to sort of pull on that thread. But after I had to return to modes and ways of creating that allowed me to be free still, that's essentially what the safety pin does. It's one object that has been designed and never been redesigned, really, because it just functions in this way that really actually holds a lot of value. And there's so many times where you're like, oh my God, I could fix this with a safety pin, but I don't have a safety pin. So I think just the safety pin just naturally has found its way into the work, such that being known for being a safety pin polymath now, I think it's accurate because I never tried. It just happened. I remember when I was in Fashion East, a lot of the reviews were like, from this angle of like, we think we like it, but we're not really sure, but does it really matter because it's really exciting? I studied fashion design and marketing at LCF before MA at CSM. And one thing that I was always really interested in is how, I always hated marketing. I always thought that they kind of just killed everything. And I was always intrigued by guerrilla marketing strategies. In the first 10 years, you need to meet the brand in the streets. You need to see it on people. You need to have a genuine interest in it, rather than just seeing it at London Fashion Week and then meeting it from there. I think it's really way more interesting when you saw it on somebody that was wearing it and you stopped and asked them, oh my God, where did you get that top?
Thinking about marketing, I want to talk about celebrity endorsement, and firstly, who you have in mind, who you find interesting to dress.
I think the person that I find the most interesting to dress is a Black woman. When I was growing up, the muse was always Rihanna. If she could make it out, then I can too. And she really inspired me to make me realize, actually, you can get to the world. You can. I think when you grow up in a small island, in a small place, you feel like you can get there, but there's no real proof. It's just something that you maybe have made up in your head, and maybe you're delusional. So I think seeing her journey, it inspired me from I can do this point of view, but also from a muse point of view. She's the best one, because all of the things that I was interested in, she was also interested in, and would include those things in her music, in her cultural referencing, in her works, in the music videos. Then she started to pull in the interests from other cultures that I naturally found related to my culture as well. So pulling in the rock elements, pulling in even the soca elements, and sort of like bringing in all of these anti-fashion, anti-industry way of working. I think she really inspired me from a practice point of view, but as a muse, she also was doing exactly that same thing. The Jawara Alleyne muse and character is an underdog, and I think the biggest underdog, if we're looking at the demographics of people, is a Black woman. Somebody that has to learn how to be strong, somebody that has no other option but to build up that sense of strength, build up that sense of confidence. And if we're talking about fashion, this is what fashion actually allows you to do. In terms of the practice of fashion, you really see it matter when you look at the way that Black women use and treat fashion, whether it is in a fashion context, whether it's in the church, whether it's in communities, whether it's at parties, whether it's to attract guys, whether it's on Love Island, wherever it exists, there's always a usage of fashion in a tangible way that really goes beyond the zeitgeist of fashion and goes beyond the aesthetics of fashion.
That whole approach to sort of cultural exchange and that usage of fashion really comes through both in this conversation but just generally in your work. And I'm interested to think a bit about how that support from the Cayman Islands has continued for your recent shows, and also you did the exhibition at the National Gallery of the Cayman Islands last year. And I guess I want to start by talking about the importance of that support, but also to have that sort of exchange between doing things in the Cayman Islands, but then also doing these shows in London, and who that's for, both kind of benefiting Caribbean artists and creatives, but also having that dialogue in London, like how you see that exchange.
Working with them gives me avenues to really do things within fashion and use fashion in a way that we haven't seen it being used before, because I'm not necessarily selling my product on island. So there isn't that sort of commercial exchange for me that does not, the commercial exchange does not define the reason why I work with and in Cayman. And also because I'm an educator as well. There's so many other avenues within the practice of fashion that I can use my skills to support.
I mean, I want to talk about those avenues a bit, because I know that you lecture at CSM, you've gone back and done summer camps for kids in the Cayman Islands. So can we talk a bit about that? And then I also want to talk about the kind of artist side and the artworks. The
only artist that I saw in my community was an art teacher. So I thought I was going to become a teacher. Like, if I had followed the path and became an artist, I didn't understand at that time what an artist's career looked like. So the only representation that I had was of my art teachers. So I always thought I was going to become a teacher. When I got my first job in fashion, I worked at a brand called Peter Pilato that did women's wear, print. They were fab. They won the Design of the Year. But at LCF, they only gave you 1 month. So I was supposed to go back to school. And they came to me on the side and they were like, we don't want you to go back to school, so we're gonna offer you a job. I was very good at listening and also actioning things without needing to be asked. But being a part of a lot of conversations that were happening on both sides of the room, I kind of understood a lot of the concerns that interns were having at that time up until now. But I would also do like a review within their internship to understand where, what they've learned, what they reflected on, really sort of like being a part and in dialogue with them to make sure that they understand that they can ask for things. Because a lot of times as well, when you're an intern, you feel like you can't ask anybody anything because there's nobody really there to ask. Nobody's assigned to you. Or somebody that you can have dialogue with other than the other interns that will give you some kind of answer. If there isn't that financial exchange, that there is an exchange that can be managed and tracked and can be dialogued and to ensure that you're actually getting something out of it.
How does art come into your language as a fashion brand?
I've always painted in the background. I've always continued sketching in the background. Things that I never saw as serious. It was just stuff that I would just do as a hobby. So I always did fine art, painting, acrylic specifically. I used to do watercolor, but then I was like, that's a little bit too Caribbean. I need to push a little bit further than watercolors. Notably, post CSM and what I learned from the Fashionista shows, those 4 collections, I was exploring different things and trying out different ways of building that practice. And I think it's from there that I started to expand philosophically how I can approach fashion and how I can create fashion. So those collections really allowed me to kind of go a little bit deeper philosophically, also because I had a lot of time in COVID to really think about what is the approach that I'm putting into this work. And I can have a practice that leans into and builds on a philosophical approach in the way that I treat my references, in the way that I source product, in the way that I dialogue about my work, in the way that I include people into that practice as well.
I'd love you to tell me a bit about Space 7.5. So you've moved to a new studio, and I think it's nice having talked a lot about, how laying these kind of foundations, how you use lots of different tools and codes to build this kind of 360 world, which clothes are one part of. Mm-hmm. What is Space 7.5 and why is that important to create a space this summer where people could come in?
The space always just naturally became what it needed for what was required at that time. Very much like the collections allow me a space where I explore the questions that matter at that time. But within the space, we sometimes do our fittings there if we need to do fittings. At the time we were making within the space. Sometimes we're hosting in the space. So the space is always this singular space that becomes what it needs, almost like a room of requirement, functioning as a shop. But it's just the solidifying of that concept of a space that can facilitate and hold multiple different things. It doesn't need to be a permanent shop all the time. Because it was always functioning like that, it just felt quite natural to just continue that and solidify it into something that isn't a private part of the brand, but it's something that is known and something that people can access. Because I also think that you need to give access points to people that isn't just about selling products. From a lot of the conversations that I have with young people now, from interviews and my interns, it is crazy to me that the new generation of kids, they don't look up to big brands at all. You ask them who's your favorite brand and they tell you an Instagram profile that posts archive stuff. That's their favorite brand. And I find that to be really interesting because brands are not offering access points into their world that sits separate from buy the product, you may get invited to the party. If you're in the press, you can come to the show. Everything has become this far removed thing that doesn't really reach the world. And I can see a very clear shift in the way that this generation perceives fashion, in that it truly holds no meaning to them because the brands are not really permeating the worlds of these kids in a way that allows for access points into how you can grow an audience even before they buy the product. It's luxury, but it's not aspirational. The product that I sell is not a product, it's a value. You're buying the memory that it felt when you saw that t-shirt. I see the brand having its flagship within the islands. I see the brand developing industry around itself within the islands. Because we have fashion. If I talk about the Caribbean as a region, we have fashion, but we don't really have a robust industry. I see a career that really has no limits, because I'm actually genuinely quite talented. And anything that you give me, I can actually do.